Deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, a German submarine lay silent for decades, its steel hull concealing secrets that would make even experienced salvage divers refuse to continue their work. When a team finally entered U-505 in 1954, what they discovered inside was not just the remains of Nazi technology. It was evidence of something far more disturbing. Personal belongings were scattered across the floor. Cryptic messages were scrawled on the walls. And in the captain's quarters, documents revealed a truth so shocking that the US Navy classified the findings for over 20 years. This is the terrifying story of what really happened aboard U-505 and why what divers found inside still haunts investigators today. June 4, 1944. The Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of West Africa. German submarine U-505 cuts through the dark waters, hunting Allied convoys. Her crew of 59 men has no idea they are about to make history, but not in the way they imagined. U-505 was a Type 9C U-boat, one of Germany's most successful submarine classes. At 252 feet long and displacing 1,120 tons, she was a formidable weapon of war. Launched in 1941 from the Deutsche Werft shipyard in Hamburg, this vessel had already survived 12 combat patrols, sinking 8 Allied ships and damaging 4 others. Her kill record made her one of the Kriegsmarine's prized assets in the Battle of the Atlantic. But U-505 had a dark reputation among German submariners. 3 different captains had commanded her, and each tenure ended in tragedy or disgrace. Her first commander, Kapitänleutnant Axel Olaf Lover, suffered a complete mental breakdown after just 2 patrols, reportedly screaming about voices in the hull before being removed from duty. The second captain, Korvettenkapitän Peter Schech, committed suicide aboard the boat during a depth charge attack in October 1943. He was the only U-boat commander in German naval history to take his own life while on active patrol. The crew whispered that U-505 was cursed. They spoke of strange sounds echoing through the pressure hull at night, equipment malfunctioning without explanation, men reporting nightmares so vivid they refused to sleep. One engineer kept a secret diary that was discovered years later describing what he called the presence that seemed to move through the submarine's narrow corridors. By June 1944, U-505 was under the command of Oberleutnant zur See Harold Lange, a young officer who did not believe in curses. He believed in the Kriegsmarine, in Hitler's promises of secret weapons that would turn the tide of war. What Lange did not know was that Allied intelligence had already broken the German naval codes. His submarine was not the hunter anymore. It was the hunted. On that fateful June morning, U-505 was running on the surface, recharging her batteries. The lookouts scanned the horizon, but they missed the American destroyer escort, USS Chatelaine, approaching at full speed. Captain Daniel Gallery Jr. of the US Navy had been hunting U-boats for months, and he had developed an obsession with capturing one intact. Not sinking it, capturing it. What happened next would become the first enemy warship seized by the US Navy since the War of 1812. But the true significance of this capture would not be understood for decades. Because what Gallery and his boarding party found inside U-505 would expose secrets that some in the German High Command had wanted buried forever. The question that still haunts historians today is simple but chilling. Was U-505 really cursed? Or was something else happening aboard that submarine? Something that explains why 3 of its captains met such horrific ends, and why the men who finally entered its hull were never quite the same afterward. The attack on U-505 began at 11:10 a.m. on June 4, 1944. The sonar operator on USS Chatelaine detected the submarine at 800 yards. Captain Gallery did not hesitate. He ordered an immediate depth charge attack, launching a pattern of hedgehog projectiles, forward-throwing anti-submarine weapons that detonated on contact. The explosions ripped through the water. Inside U-505, chaos erupted. The lights went out. Water began spraying from ruptured pipes. The stern plainsman reported a loss of control. Oberleutnant Langer faced an impossible choice: go deeper and risk being crushed, or surface and face the American guns. He chose to surface. U-505 broke through the waves at 11:22 a.m., wallowing in the heavy seas. American fighters immediately strafed the conning tower with machine gun fire. The German crew began pouring out of the hatches, many without life jackets, diving into the ocean in blind panic. They were certain their submarine would sink within minutes. Standard procedure was to open the seacocks and scuttle the boat before the enemy could board her. But here is where the story takes its first disturbing turn. The German crew had set the scuttling charges and opened the cooling water intakes to flood the engine room. They abandoned ship, believing U-505 would sink. But something stopped the flooding. According to the American boarding party's later testimony, when they entered the submarine, they found the scuttling charges had been disconnected, not by accident, but deliberately cut. The seacocks that should have been wide open were partially closed. Someone aboard U-505 wanted her to be captured. Lieutenant Albert David led the American boarding party. A volunteer crew of 8 men rowed across from USS Pillsbury in a small whaleboat, racing against time. They could see U-505 settling lower in the water, her bow already awash. David was the first to step onto the submarine's deck, fully expecting it to sink beneath his feet at any moment. For this act of extraordinary courage, he would later receive the Medal of Honor. What David and his team found when they dropped through the conning tower hatch was unlike anything they had been trained for. The submarine's interior was in chaos, but not the chaos of battle. Personal belongings were strewn everywhere. Photographs, letters, and clothing lay scattered across the deck plates, as if someone had ransacked every locker in a frantic search. Emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie red glow. Water was ankle-deep in some compartments, but the flooding was surprisingly slow, much slower than it should have been. Radioman First Class Stanley WWII, part of the boarding party, later described the smell they found. It was not just diesel fuel and sweat like you would expect. There was something else, something sweet and wrong, like decay, but they could not find any bodies. The smell seemed to come from the walls themselves. The American sailors worked frantically to stop the flooding. They closed valves, stuffed rags into leaking pipes, and pumped water out of the bilges. But all the while, they noticed disturbing details. In the petty officers' quarters, someone had scratched words into the metal bulkhead. German phrases, when later translated, read "They are watching" and "Do not trust the water." In the radio room, the Enigma machine sat ready, the biggest intelligence prize of the war. Next to it, the radioman's logbook lay open to a page filled with incomprehensible notations, not radio traffic, but what appeared to be coordinates leading to nowhere, positions in the middle of the Atlantic where no shipping lanes existed. Years later, historians would discover these coordinates marked locations where other U-boats had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. The captain's quarters revealed even more troubling evidence. Oberleutnant Langer had left behind his personal diary. The final entries were deeply disturbing. Langer wrote of cargo we should never have accepted and experiments that belong in hell, not at sea. He described crew members becoming infected with paranoia and reported that the boat's previous captain's suicide was not what they told the families. But the most terrifying discovery came when the boarding party reached the forward torpedo room. This is where U-boats stored their most valuable cargo, the torpedoes themselves, along with provisions and sometimes secret materials being transported to or from distant bases. The Americans expected to find torpedoes. What they found instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 6 containers, each about 3 feet long and 18 inches wide, made of stainless steel and marked with medical symbols, were stacked in the compartment. They were not standard German naval equipment. According to the detailed inventory compiled by the US Navy, these containers were connected to a refrigeration system that had been jury-rigged into the submarine's electrical network, a modification that had drained power from other critical systems. When the containers were carefully opened aboard the USS Guadalcanal, naval medical personnel discovered they contained biological samples, human tissue specimens preserved in formaldehyde. The samples were not from casualties or medical emergencies. They were deliberately collected and labeled with German scientific notation. The samples were accompanied by documents bearing the letterhead of the Institute for Military Scientific Research, a Nazi organization later revealed to have conducted horrific medical experiments. The paperwork indicated these samples were being transported from a secret facility codenamed Wolfschanze II to another location in occupied Norway. Here is what makes this even more chilling. The dates on the document showed this was not U-505's first such cargo run. The submarine had apparently made at least 3 previous trips carrying similar materials. The crew's paranoia, the previous captain's suicide, and the strange mechanical failures all dated back to when U-505 began these special transport missions. This was in early 1943. United States Navy psychiatrist Commander James Forrestal interviewed several members of U-505's crew after their capture. The interviews, declassified in 1985, reveal a pattern of psychological trauma among the German sailors. Multiple crew members reported the same symptoms: insomnia, auditory hallucinations, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One sailor, Matrosneberger Freiter Wolfgang Stahl, refused to speak for 3 days after his capture, then suddenly broke down and described screaming from the containers at night. The German prisoners were adamant that the containers had been loaded aboard against Captain Langer's protests. According to their testimony, Langer had been given direct orders from Kriegsmarine headquarters that superseded his authority. 2 Gestapo officers had personally supervised the loading, and they threatened the crew with execution if they discussed the cargo. But what was in those containers before they reached Allied hands? That question leads to one of World War II's most disturbing cover-ups. United States Navy records show that the containers and their contents were immediately transferred to a military research facility at Fort Detrick in Maryland, America's biological warfare headquarters. What happened to the samples after that remains classified. The Navy's official report on U-505's capture, released in 1947, makes no mention of the containers at all. They were simply erased from the historical record. For decades, only a handful of people knew the truth. The sailors who boarded U-505 were sworn to secrecy. The German prisoners were interrogated separately and held in isolation. The containers disappeared into the classified world of military intelligence. U-505 herself was towed to Bermuda, then eventually to the United States. The Navy studied every inch of her, extracting technological secrets and intelligence materials. The Enigma machine and codebooks captured aboard helped Allied codebreakers decrypt German naval communications for the remainder of the war, potentially saving thousands of lives. But throughout all the technical examinations, one mystery remained. Why did the submarine smell wrong? Multiple inspection teams reported the same strange odor that the boarding party had noticed, that sweet, decaying smell that seemed to emanate from the pressure hull itself. Navy engineers could not explain it. They stripped paint, removed insulation, searched for hidden compartments, but found no source. In 1954, U-505 was donated to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, where she remains today as the only German U-boat in the United States. Before she went on public display, museum workers spent months cleaning and restoring the vessel. Their reports describe finding more scratched messages hidden throughout the boat, desperate inscriptions in German that spoke of fear, paranoia, and something the crew called Das Ding im Schatten, which means the thing in the shadows. One museum worker, a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, who had served in the Kriegsmarine during the war, quit after 3 weeks of working inside U-505. He told the museum director that the submarine was not a place for the living and refused to elaborate further. Weber died in 1962, but his daughter discovered a letter he had written about his experience. In it, he described hearing sounds inside the submarine when he was alone, a metallic scraping, distant whispers, and once, footsteps moving through the forward compartment while he was working in the stern. The museum dismissed these stories as superstition, but they could not dismiss the pattern of accidents. Over the years, multiple workers reported injuries, equipment failures, and unexplained incidents while working on or inside U-505. In 1977, a restoration specialist named Thomas Brock was found unconscious in the control room, suffering from what doctors called acute psychological shock. He claimed to have seen something in the shadows near the periscope station, but could never articulate what it was. In 2004, 60 years after U-505's capture, classified files began to emerge. A Freedom of Information Act request by naval historian Timothy Mulligan uncovered portions of the original interrogation records from the German crew. What he found vindicated the sailors' stories and exposed a program that the Nazi regime had successfully kept hidden even after the war ended. The word classified takes on a new, chilling meaning here. The containers aboard U-505 were part of Operation Blutprobe, a secret Nazi program to develop biological weapons using human subjects from concentration camps. The tissue samples being transported were infected with experimental pathogens, shipped between research facilities for analysis and refinement. The research was experimental, and deliberately so. Here is the revelation that terrifies experts even today. The refrigeration system aboard U-505 malfunctioned during the submarine's final patrol. The temperature logs recovered from the boat showed that for approximately 48 hours before the submarine was captured, the containers had been at room temperature. Whatever pathogens were being transported had been exposed to conditions that could have caused them to become airborne within the submarine's closed environment. The word refrigeration is central to understanding the danger. The crew of U-505 had been breathing contaminated air. This helps explain the psychological symptoms, the paranoia, the hallucinations. Several of the pathogens later identified by the Fort Detrick analysis included experimental neurotoxins designed to cause exactly these effects. German researchers had been developing biological agents meant to incapacitate enemy troops through psychological breakdown rather than death. Weapons intended to make soldiers too terrified to fight. The word contaminated captures the human cost. The American boarding party had also been exposed. Of the 8 men who first entered U-505, 3 died before the age of 50 from unusual neurological conditions. Lieutenant Albert David, the Medal of Honor recipient who led the boarding, suffered from severe nightmares and anxiety for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke about what he experienced aboard the submarine. In a 1976 letter to a fellow veteran, he wrote that he had seen combat and had faced death, but nothing prepared him for what they found in that boat. He added that some nights he still woke up convinced he could smell it. Nightmares and anxiety haunted him. The German crew members fared even worse. Of the 59 men captured from U-505, 12 died in prisoner of war camps from mysterious illnesses before the war ended. Another 20 reported chronic health problems after their release, including neurological disorders, immune system failures, and psychiatric conditions. The mortality rate among U-505 survivors was significantly higher than among other U-boat crews captured during the war. The higher mortality rate is undeniable. Captain Lang himself survived the war and returned to Germany, but he never spoke publicly about his final patrol. When approached by historians in the 1960s, he refused all interviews. He died in 1968, and his family reported that he suffered from severe depression and anxiety throughout his post-war life. Among his personal effects, they found a sealed envelope addressed to whoever finds this. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence in German. It read, "We were guinea pigs, and the experiment never ended." The word guinea pigs sums up the horror. The final piece of this terrifying puzzle emerged in 2019 when German researchers gained access to previously unknown Nazi medical records. They discovered that U-505's crew had been selected specifically for this mission because of their medical profiles, not for their naval skills. The entire crew had been given routine inoculations before departing on their final patrol, but the medical records show these were not normal vaccines. They were experimental treatments designed to test whether pre-exposure to certain compounds would protect against the biological agents being transported. The Nazi researchers were using the entire submarine as a floating laboratory. The crew did not know they were test subjects. The phrase floating laboratory should make us all uneasy. Today, U-505 sits in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, visited by thousands of people every year. Most walk through the submarine unaware of the dark secrets she carried. The museum's official history focuses on the heroic capture, the intelligence value of the Enigma machine, and the technological marvel of U-boat engineering. But a few visitors know to look for the details: the scratched messages on the bulkheads preserved during restoration, the unexplained modifications to the electrical system, and the captain's quarters, where Lang documented his horror at the cargo he had been forced to carry. The full extent of Operation Blutprobe remains partially classified. Researchers estimate that at least 12 other U-boats made similar transport runs, carrying biological weapons research between secret facilities. Most of these submarines were sunk during the war, taking their deadly cargo to the bottom of the Atlantic. Some have never been found. The disturbing reality is that we may never know the full truth about what happened aboard U-505. The biological samples were destroyed or remain classified. The German researchers who developed the pathogens were either killed in the war or fled to Argentina and were never brought to justice. The Nazi medical records were incomplete or deliberately destroyed. What we do know is that U-505 was more than a warship. She was a weapon aimed at her own crew, a testament to the Nazi regime's complete disregard for human life, including the lives of their own soldiers. The men who served aboard her were victims of an experiment they never consented to, suffering psychological and physical trauma that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The American sailors who captured her were heroes, but they paid a price that was not acknowledged for decades. They were exposed to biological agents that the US military did not fully understand and could not properly treat. Some of them carried the physical and psychological scars until their deaths. U-505 stands as a memorial to all of them, German and American alike, caught in the machinery of a war that saw human beings as disposable resources in the pursuit of ever more horrific weapons. The submarine's story raises questions that remain unanswered. How many other vessels carried similar cargo? What happened to the research data recovered from U-505? Are there still biological weapons from World War II lying on the ocean floor, waiting to be disturbed by salvage operations or oceanographic research? Remember, history is not always the heroic story we are taught in school. Sometimes the truth is terrifying. Sometimes the most disturbing secrets are hiding in plain sight, preserved inside a submarine in a Chicago museum, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. But the most terrifying Nazi secret was not hidden in a submarine. It was buried in a bunker beneath Berlin. Hitler's personal bodyguard remained silent for 60 years about what he witnessed in the Führer's final hours. When he finally spoke before his death, what he revealed was so disturbing, it changed everything we thought we knew about April 30th, 1945. Click above to hear his deathbed confession.